Alright, welcome to a very short devlog where I'm just going to show what I've been kind of working on here. I'm not sure how to best actually demonstrate it. I'm not sure if I can really demonstrate it. It's kind of something you have to feel. But if I come in here and I go straight to the pause menu, you can see I now have Space Drone input curves. Also, you might notice that during the pause menu it doesn't make any more sounds. So if I go to the Space Drone input curves, you can see that I prefer a pretty flat response at the moment. But what you may not know is that I bought the best joysticks that I could for my game controller. So for a lot of people, their joysticks aren't quite as good, and they get a couple of things going on. One thing they get is a really spiky signal. The other thing they get is a really short distance between when they're at no input and max input. It's a little bit more like they're driving buttons, which can be frustrating when you're trying to do something like dock, because you want to make very small inputs. And you could turn your power down a lot, but with RC quadcopter drones, with drone racing and freestyle and stuff like that, what you have is you have input curves, and mine are very simple right now. They're not a nice S where you can get that mid-range in there a little earlier in the stick throw, but like I said, for most people, the junky joystick, if you just kind of ease off the front end of it a little bit, then that makes the biggest difference in the world. And then you can dock, and then everything else you can be at full throttle anyway. So if you move this slider here, you can see it starts to get a little bit of a curve to it. If you crank that up a little bit, it only goes up to power 2, but if you go all the way to squared, then you can see it's got a pretty shallow increase at the beginning, and then it goes up to the same place, max, as a straight curve. So using the Expo, and you have it for each, then you can have a little bit nicer control right there in the middle of the stick. So if you were going to aim, in this case you would use it for docking, but let's say you were going to play a video game that you were going to aim a gun, and you wanted a nice smooth response in the middle, then you could use these response curves as well, and then you move the stick a little bit more to get a little bit less input at the beginning towards the middle, but then once you get out towards the edge where you want to go all the way fast, it goes all the way fast again. So these input curves are for each vehicle. So actually in the interior, it's actually a different vehicle. Now I thought I fixed this. Oh, my joystick isn't running, that's why. So as you can see, that there's Space Drone Small. On the interior, it's actually a lighter mass, and in this lighter mass, that's when you're going to have a more important time with the input curves, because you can see even at normal, it's really bouncy. So if I play a little bit higher, it's quite a bit bouncier, and I want to be able to turn around quick, but I don't want to have all this jumpy activity in the middle here. So then what I can do is I can go to the input curves, and I can throw myself some input curves on the rotational axes, and hit save. Now they're all saved. And then a little bit, a bigger input is still pretty big, but a smaller input is a little bit smaller. So that when I'm towards the middle, I can move my stick a little bit more and still get that smaller input. So it kind of helps with fine control, especially with more agile vehicles than ours. So when players want to go in there and they want to come in here and they want to crank the power settings, because you can make any vehicle feel very powerful for its size just by cranking the power settings, and they want to have a lot of rotation so they can whip their ship around really fast, but they want a lot of control, and then you can use these Expo settings right here. And if you're a beginner, I strongly advise you to use them, because you might think you're a terrible pilot, you might think you're clumsy, you can't do, but you might find that if your joysticks weren't quite so sensitive when they did, a lot of cheap joysticks especially, they don't do anything right in the middle. There's a physical hardware dead zone where there's no change in input. It's like just rubbing on a piece of metal. And then when you get over onto the potentiometer, it just gets really all the way to max right away. So it's almost like a button. So having these curves gives you just that little bit where you just start to touch that potentiometer. It's not quite as big of a spike because you're kind of getting rid of it a little bit with these input curves. And another thing I thought about, especially because of cheap joysticks, if I go back to a ship that has, let me come in here. If I go back to a ship that has some of the smoothing, so I'll go into the forward only vehicle, and if I turn on my one of these other cameras that has the pivot, you can see that my stability here is a lot better. It used to jump around a lot more dramatically. And what I did there was I put a 6-frame filter on there, and it's pretty responsive. It's not quite as responsive. There's a little bit of latency that gets added because what happens is it tracks the joystick position over the course of 6 frames and then divides that number. It adds them all together and divides it by 6. That's all my code is doing. There's a lot of complexity that you can get into with filters. There's really high technology stuff with robot stabilization, with all kinds of filtering of the signal. But in this game right now, for the camera, I'm just using a 6-frame, simple, basic divide by 6 filter. And if I put something like that on the input curves, you would get a tiny bit of latency depending on your computer. My computer's pretty good, so the latency is less, but if you're kind of chugging along on a older computer, then you might have a little bit more latency when you start, because my frames are being produced by a top-of-the-line CPU, so I'm producing a lot more frames per second. But if you're generating 60 frames per second and you're only worrying about keeping track of 6, at some point that latency is just placebo. And if you have a slower computer and you're only getting about 30 frames per second, you're still only keeping track of 6. So you're only keeping track of a tiny percent of a second. And so that dividing by 6, that average that happens, it takes 6 frames for you to get to the full value. And then when it's bouncing around, it doesn't bounce around quite so much. So I probably will make a toggleable input filter option for the cheaper joysticks especially as well, so that when you're docking, it doesn't seem like you push your joystick a little bit, but every once in a while it goes really hard. Again, I have pretty good joysticks. Even my joysticks occasionally feel like the output that comes out of there is a spike, and it's higher than it should be. So when a cheaper joystick, it's terrible, and you barely touch it, and it's like wham, max power. And if you have some filtering on there, then it might even it out a little bit, is what I'm thinking. And I'll probably go to put some of that in there, maybe tomorrow, I don't know. I'm pretty much done for today. And so then the other thing about the input curve is that you can turn it off just with the toggle button. So if you want to have no input curve when you're doing high-speed racing, and you want to have some input curve when you're docking, and you don't want to switch your power level, you want the same power level, but you just want a little bit of input curve, so that when you're doing certain races, you can have input curve for part of the race or something like that. It's actually on a toggle button. You can just turn it on, turn it off, and then after a little while, the indicator will go away. I may put other indicators on a timer. Some indicators, like power level, if you're going to be switching a lot, maybe I think it's nice to have it just up the whole time. And these other stuff is kind of all in the same place anyways, the rotation bars, and you can toggle all that stuff off too, so, anyways. So, and then just real quick, just in case we didn't look at it, this is the forward only vehicle, and it only goes forward. So you can rotate it around, but let me get to a camera that I move my buttons around, so I figure which one's what. You can go forward, but you can't go any side-to-side direction, and you can't go reverse. So if you want to turn around and you want to go back the other way, you have to rotate around, and then you can go pick the reverse, and that's why it's important that I have this reverse camera. So you can see this one is looking out the back. So that way when you're trying to slow down, the hard part here is that your roll is backwards when you're looking at the screen, and also pitch is backwards. But your left and right is the same, so because some of it's the same and some of it's different, you can get confused pretty easily and always pick the wrong one. Which is something that having a little bit of input curve so that the input is not quite so dramatic when you first put it in. If you're just starting to move your finger and then you start to see that you're going the wrong way and that you didn't get quite so much power into it, then it's not quite such a cost, and your whole flying experience can be a little bit smoother. Not necessarily guaranteed, but overall it can be a little bit smoother. So that's my devlog for today. Thank you very much.